Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a Europe where the air itself seemed suspicious, where every knock at the door carried the possibility of terrible news, and where a strange figure dressed in black, wearing a mask with the beak of an enormous bird, slowly walked silent streets that most people feared to enter, long before hospitals smelled of disinfectant and doctors relied on microscopes. People searched desperately for anything that might explain why healthy neighbors suddenly collapsed, why entire families disappeared within days, and why even the richest citizens discovered that gold could not bargain with death. Tonight, you'll accompany one of history's most misunderstood medical figures, not as a fearless hero, nor as a sinister villain, but as a complicated witness to humanity's endless struggle against disease. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy these slow historical journeys. And now, dim the lights. Perhaps leave a small fan humming softly in the background, and let us drift gently into the unsettling, fascinating world of plague doctors. The morning began before sunrise, when darkness still clung stubbornly to the narrow streets of a provincial European town. The church bells had not yet announced the first hour of daylight, yet someone was already awake. The man sat quietly beside a wooden table, illuminated by a single candle, whose flame danced whenever a draft slipped beneath the door. Outside, the world remained almost silent. Even the stray dogs seemed reluctant to bark. He was not yet wearing the famous beaked mask that future generations would remember so vividly. Instead, he looked surprisingly ordinary. His beard needed trimming. His hands were rough from years of work. His clothes, folded carefully across a nearby chair, showed patches where fabric had been repaired repeatedly instead of replaced. Contrary to modern imagination, plague doctors were not mysterious creatures who permanently dressed like giant black birds. Most of the time, they looked like any educated man trying to earn a living during an extraordinarily dangerous profession. He reached for a small leather notebook. Inside were names. Some names had tiny crosses beside them. Others had circles. Some had no markings at all. Each symbol represented uncertainty rather than certainty. A crossed name often meant the patient had died. A circle might indicate recovery. Empty space meant nobody, yet knew the outcome. Medicine in 17th century Europe possessed many observations, but relatively few reliable answers. People noticed patterns: cold winters, warm summers, crowded neighborhoods, foul-smelling rivers, yet understanding exactly why epidemics spread remained painfully beyond reach. Many physicians believed poisonous air, called miasma, carried disease. Bad smells were not merely unpleasant. They were considered dangerous. Rotting garbage, stagnant water, decaying animals, overflowing cesspits, these offensive odors appeared suspicious because sickness so often accompanied them, while modern science now explains that plague is primarily caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis asterisk, carried historically by fleas living on rodents. Physicians of the era lacked microscopes powerful enough to discover invisible microorganisms. Instead, they relied upon what experience seemed to suggest. The notebook closed with a soft thump. Another day waited. Across Europe, outbreaks of plague appeared again and again over centuries. Though not every epidemic reached the catastrophic scale of the Black Death that devastated the 14th century, the disease returned repeatedly, sometimes decades apart, sometimes striking neighboring regions with cruel unpredictability. Communities that believed themselves safely spared often watched in horror as fresh cases suddenly emerged. No one truly knew whether this season would remain quiet or become unforgettable. The physician rose slowly. His assistant had already prepared the equipment. A long waxed overcoat hung beside the entrance. Heavy gloves rested neatly underneath. A broad-brimmed hat waited on its peg. Finally came the object that history would immortalize. The mask. Modern audiences often imagine the beaked mask as an ancient invention used throughout the medieval Black Death of the 1340s. Surprisingly, that image belongs mostly to a later period. The iconic beak became associated particularly with physicians during 17th century plague outbreaks, especially in parts of Italy and France. Earlier medieval doctors generally dressed quite differently. History often compresses centuries into a single image. Reality rarely cooperates. The assistant carefully opened the mask. Its empty eye holes reflected candlelight. The curved beak projected outward several inches. Within that hollow space, dried herbs would soon be packed tightly. Rose petals, mint, camphor, juniper, lavender, sometimes cloves, sometimes cinnamon. Different physicians preferred different mixtures depending upon local customs, personal beliefs, and available supplies. These pleasant fragrances served an important purpose according to contemporary medical theory. If poisonous air caused plague, then filtering inhaled air through sweet-smelling substances might offer protection. Today, we recognize that these herbs could not stop bacteria carried by infected fleas. Yet, dismissing the practice entirely would overlook something important. The mask also created a small physical barrier between physician and patient. Thick clothing reduced skin exposure. Gloves discouraged direct contact. Although designed for reasons physicians misunderstood, portions of the outfit accidentally provided modest protection against certain hazards. History frequently advances through strange accidents. People sometimes discover partial solutions long before understanding why those solutions occasionally help. Outside, dawn finally arrived. It was not a dramatic sunrise. Clouds softened the light into pale gray. Mist drifted between timber-framed houses. A milk cart stood abandoned, where someone had left it yesterday. Nobody had returned. The doctor stepped into the street. His boots echoed loudly, because so few other footsteps answered. In healthier times, these roads bustled with merchants, apprentices, children chasing each other, washerwomen gossiping across windows, and farmers arriving with wagons loaded with vegetables. Now shutters remained closed. Doors opened only slightly. Eyes watched through tiny gaps. Fear transformed architecture itself. People learned to communicate without approaching one another. A woman appeared at an upstairs window. She recognized the physician immediately. Rather than waving, she simply nodded. Her husband had developed fever during the night. She did not invite the doctor inside. Instead, she waited for him to approach while maintaining careful distance. Centuries before governments introduced modern quarantine regulations backed by microbiology, ordinary people already understood one heartbreaking lesson. Sick households often produced more sickness. Exactly why remained uncertain. That it happened repeatedly seemed impossible to ignore. The physician paused beneath the window. How long? He asked quietly. Since yesterday afternoon. Breathing. Worse. Coffee. A little. Buboes. Silence. Then came the answer, almost whispered. Under his arm. The doctor lowered his eyes. Swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, had given bubonic plague its name. Painful, enlarged swellings commonly appeared near the groin, armpits, or neck after infection. They varied in size and severity, but survivors consistently remembered the agony they caused. He had heard enough. The woman did not need lengthy explanations. She already understood what the physician suspected. He entered slowly. Inside, the air felt warm despite the cold morning. A fire still burned in the hearth. Someone had attempted to keep the patient comfortable through the night. The room smelled faintly of vinegar. This, too, reflected common medical practice. Vinegar appeared frequently in plague remedies because many believed it purified contaminated air or cleansed dangerous substances from surfaces. Near the fireplace lay bundles of dried rosemary. Someone had burned part of them earlier. Their smoke lingered softly among ceiling beams, blackened by decades of cooking fires. The patient rested upon a narrow wooden bed. He could not have been older than 40. His breathing came unevenly. Sweat soaked the linen beneath his head. When he opened his eyes, recognition mixed with exhaustion. He tried sitting upright. The physician gently motioned for him to remain still. There would be questions. There would be examination. There would also be uncertainty, because beneath the intimidating mask, beneath the heavy coat and gloves, beneath all the confidence expected from a learned physician, stood a man confronting the same invisible mystery that frightened everyone else. He possessed education. He possessed experience, but certainty remained painfully scarce. And before this long day reached its end, both doctor and patient would discover that the true challenge of plague extended far beyond medicine alone. It reached into family, faith, commerce, government, and the quiet corners of ordinary lives, where history is so often lived without anyone realizing they are standing inside it. The morning had only just begun. The physician placed his gloved hand gently upon the man's wrist, counting each pulse with patient concentration rather than urgency. The rhythm was rapid, though not yet chaotic. Such observations mattered greatly. Without blood tests, laboratory reports, or medical imaging, physicians relied almost entirely upon what their senses revealed. They listened carefully to breathing, examined the skin, noted changes in the eyes, smelled the room, questioned family members, and compared each detail with countless previous cases committed to memory. Experience served as their closest companion. Sometimes it saved lives. Often it merely allowed them to recognize death a little sooner. The patient spoke in a dry whisper. It began with chills. The physician nodded. When, yesterday morning, while feeding the chickens, were you bitten by anything? The man frowned weakly. I don't remember. Few people would have considered that question particularly important. A flea bite was small, easily forgotten, and almost invisible after a day or two. Neither patient nor physician suspected that an insect no larger than a grain of rice could become the first link in a chain ending with an epidemic. Instead, attention focused elsewhere. Had the patient traveled recently? Had strangers visited the town? Had anyone unloaded suspicious cargo from distant ports? Had unusual weather spoiled the air? These questions seemed perfectly reasonable according to the medical understanding of the time. His wife answered each one carefully. No travelers, no ships, no fairs, no funerals. That final answer caused the physician to pause. No funerals. Interesting. Plague frequently announced itself quietly before revealing its full strength. One unexplained death might pass unnoticed. 2 deaths invited whispers. 3, within a single neighborhood, encouraged anxious conversations. By the time 6 or 7 households reported similar symptoms, communities often realized something far more serious had arrived. The physician carefully examined the swelling beneath the man's arm. Even through leather gloves, he could feel its firmness. The patient clenched his teeth, but did not cry out. Pain had become expected. The doctor withdrew silently. There was little more to examine. Instead, he began writing observations into his notebook, using small, disciplined handwriting practiced over many years. Medical records from this period often appear surprisingly detailed. Physicians described symptoms, weather, occupations, neighborhoods, and even emotional states. Although many conclusions proved scientifically incorrect, the observations themselves became valuable historical evidence centuries later. Modern historians have reconstructed countless outbreaks through these surviving notebooks. Tiny ink marks, faded paper, personal records, never intended to become windows into the future. The wife stood nearby with folded hands. She wanted reassurance. Everyone did. Instead, the physician chose honesty, wrapped gently inside cautious language. Keep him warm. She nodded. Fresh water whenever he can drink. Another nod. Separate his bedding if possible. I will. Allow few visitors. Her eyes lingered upon the mask. Will he recover? For several seconds, neither person spoke. Finally, the physician answered with words that countless doctors throughout history have repeated in one form or another. We shall do everything we can. It was neither promise nor surrender, simply truth. Outside, the street seemed slightly busier than before, though busy had acquired an entirely different meaning. Instead of merchants opening shops, several town officials carried long wooden poles tipped with white cloth. They stopped before each house, speaking quietly with residents through cracked doors or upstairs windows. Information spread slowly in ordinary years. Disease demanded faster communication. Every household needed to know whether illness had appeared nearby. Rumors, however, traveled even faster than facts. One woman insisted foreign merchants had poisoned local wells. Another blamed wandering beggars. A blacksmith quietly suggested that an unusual comet seen months earlier had foretold divine punishment. None possessed evidence. Each explanation reflected humanity's discomfort with uncertainty. When people cannot see danger, imagination eagerly supplies its own answers. This pattern has repeated itself across centuries. The physician continued toward the town square. There he found an unusual gathering. Normally, the marketplace echoed with bargaining voices, clattering carts, and the smell of bread fresh from communal ovens. Today, only a handful of traders remained. Several stalls stood empty, fruit spoiled unattended beneath rough canvas coverings. Chickens wandered freely between abandoned tables, as though inheriting territory temporarily surrendered by humans. Near the old stone fountain, two members of the town council argued in restrained voices. One favored immediate restrictions. The other feared economic disaster. If we close the gates, the first insisted, perhaps we stop it. And if there is no plague, replied the second, then we've ruined honest merchants for nothing. Their disagreement reflected an ancient dilemma. Public health and commerce rarely coexist comfortably during epidemics. Closing roads interrupted trade. Keeping roads open risked spreading disease farther. Neither choice came without cost. The physician approached quietly. Both councilmen turned immediately. You have seen another case. I have. Certain. No. The answer frustrated them. Yet certainty almost never arrived early. It emerged only after enough families suffered to remove all doubt. One councilman rubbed his temples. 3 sick this week. 4, corrected the physician softly. The official stared. 4, the cooper's daughter developed fever overnight. Nobody had yet announced it publicly. Already, the news altered the atmosphere. Silence settled across the square. Even pigeons, fluttering between rooftops, sounded unusually loud. Far above, church bells marked another passing hour. Life insisted upon continuing despite growing unease. The council thanked the physician and hurried toward the town hall. Meetings would continue late into the evening. Messengers might soon ride toward neighboring settlements. Letters would be written, warnings considered, perhaps quarantine, perhaps prayer, most likely both. The physician resumed walking. His next destination lay beyond the marketplace, near the town's poorer district, where narrow alleys twisted between overcrowded wooden houses. Here, entire families often shared single-room homes. Livestock sometimes occupied the same buildings during harsh weather. Waste disposal remained inconsistent. Rats found countless hiding places beneath loose floorboards, inside grain stores, and behind aging walls. Nobody paid them much attention. Rats had always existed. People regarded them as unpleasant nuisances rather than harbingers of catastrophe. Ironically, the creatures themselves rarely intended harm. The true danger rode invisibly upon them, fleas searching for blood. Centuries later, scientists would demonstrate how infected fleas transmitted asterisk Yersinia pestis between rodents and occasionally humans. Yet, history proved more complicated than a simple story of rats alone. Modern research suggests plague spread through multiple pathways depending upon circumstances. Fleas feeding upon humans, respiratory transmission during pneumonic plague, environmental conditions, and patterns of human movement all contributed differently across various outbreaks. Reality refused neat explanations. Even now, historians and epidemiologists continue refining their understanding. The physician stopped beside a bakery. No bread baked today. The ovens remained cold. Their owner sat outside sharpening a knife with absent-minded motions. "You've closed." The baker nodded. "My apprentice is ill." "Since when?" "Last night." The physician wrote another note. The apprentice lived across town. Another connection, another thread. Epidemics resembled enormous puzzles assembled, while pieces continued changing shape. Every new patient altered the picture. A child ran suddenly into the street before his mother caught him by the shoulder. "No farther." She pulled him back, almost instinctively. The physician noticed something unfamiliar. Children had stopped playing together. No official decree demanded it. Parents simply became cautious. History often remembers kings issuing proclamations and councils debating policy. Less frequently does it remember mothers quietly deciding their children should remain indoors. Yet such private decisions shaped epidemics just as surely as public laws. The doctor continued through increasingly narrow streets until reaching a modest stone chapel. Its doors stood open. Inside, several townspeople knelt individually rather than in crowded rows. Some prayed for healing. Others prayed for forgiveness. A few simply sought comfort in familiar surroundings. Faith occupied an enormous place in European responses to plague. For many, disease raised profound spiritual questions alongside physical suffering. Why had one household survived while another disappeared? Was illness random, natural, or divine judgment? Different communities answered differently, often blending religious belief with local traditions and inherited medical theories. The physician removed his hat respectfully before entering. The parish priest approached. "You've been busy." "I have. Worse than last year." The physician hesitated. "I cannot yet say." The priest understood. Too early. Always too early. Hope remained possible. So did disaster. Neither man wished to predict which future awaited the town. They spoke quietly about practical matters instead. Food deliveries for isolated families, care for orphaned children should the need arise, burial arrangements if deaths increased. These conversations felt strangely ordinary. Plague rarely arrived, accompanied by dramatic music or thunder. Instead, it introduced endless practical problems, requiring ordinary people to make difficult decisions, one after another. Who carries supplies? Who records the dead? Who cares for abandoned animals? Who comforts the grieving? History often celebrates dramatic battles. Far less attention falls upon those who quietly organized daily survival. As the physician stepped back into the afternoon light, a cold breeze swept through the nearly empty street, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and distant rain. Then, somewhere beyond the rooftops, another church bell began ringing. Not for the hour, not for a wedding, not for Sunday worship. A single slow toll, then another, then another. The physician stopped walking. He did not need anyone to explain what those measured bells usually meant. Someone else in the town had just died. The slow tolling continued long after the physician had identified its meaning. Each measured strike echoed across tiled rooftops, drifted through narrow alleyways, and reached homes where families instinctively fell silent. Bells carried information long before newspapers or telegraphs existed. Their voices announced celebrations, warned of fires, summoned worshippers, and perhaps most sorrowfully, reminded entire communities that another life had come to its end. The physician adjusted the brim of his hat and followed the sound. The chapel sexton stood waiting outside, his face unusually pale. "It was old Marta," he said quietly. The physician nodded once. She had lived near the eastern gate, nearly 70 years old according to local memory, though few villagers knew her exact age. Parish records sometimes disagreed with family recollections, and birthdays carried far less importance than they would centuries later. Was she ill long? Only 3 days. And the swelling. The sexton lowered his eyes. Her daughter said there was one near the neck. The physician made another note. Not every death during an epidemic resulted from plague. Europe in the 17th century knew countless dangers. Tuberculosis, smallpox, dysentery, typhus, influenza, pneumonia, infected wounds, childbirth complications, and simple malnutrition claimed lives every year. Distinguishing one disease from another challenged even experienced physicians. Yet patterns slowly revealed themselves. One death proved little. Several deaths, sharing similar symptoms, demanded attention. The physician did not enter the house immediately. Instead, he observed from the doorway. Family members remained gathered around the bed, speaking softly. Candles burned beside a wooden crucifix. A granddaughter carefully brushed loose strands of gray hair away from the old woman's forehead. Death possessed familiar rituals. Even during plague years, families tried to preserve dignity whenever circumstances allowed. Many wished to wash the body, dress it in clean clothing, and invite relatives for final prayers. During severe outbreaks, however, those customs often became difficult or even impossible. Fear of infection, official regulations, and the sheer number of deaths could force painful changes upon traditions that had endured for generations. The physician offered a quiet blessing before stepping back outside. There was little he could do for the deceased. His responsibility remained with the living. By midday, clouds had thickened overhead. Rain began as a fine mist, barely noticeable at first. Moisture settled upon rooftops, darkened wooden beams, and transformed dusty streets into slippery ribbons of mud. Shopkeepers who still dared remain open pulled canvas awnings farther outward. Business remained slow. People hurried home rather than lingering to exchange gossip. The physician crossed the marketplace once more and noticed something unusual near the grain warehouse. Cats, several cats, prowled around stacked barrels, stalking mice that darted between sacks of wheat. Their presence seemed ordinary enough. In fact, many towns welcomed cats because they controlled rodent populations. Few realized just how important that seemingly simple relationship could become. Although popular culture often blames rats alone for spreading plague, the ecological story proved far more complex. Fleas, rodents, human behavior, climate, food storage, shipping routes, and countless environmental factors interacted in ways that historians and scientists continue studying today. History rarely follows a single cause. Instead, it resembles thousands of threads woven tightly together. A wagon rumbled slowly through the square. Its driver wore a scarf wrapped high across his face. Inside lay several barrels of vinegar, The council had purchased nearly every available supply. Citizens would use it to wipe furniture, soak cloths, wash hands, clean door handles, and sprinkle floors. Vinegar occupied an almost legendary place in plague prevention throughout Europe. While it could not eliminate Yersinia pestis from infected fleas, its mild antiseptic properties occasionally proved useful for cleaning certain surfaces, though not in the miraculous manner people imagined. Still, in an age without antibiotics, even imperfect attempts at hygiene represented sincere efforts to understand an invisible enemy. The physician greeted the wagon driver. "Busy day." The man laughed without humor. "I've never sold so much vinegar. Do you believe it works?" The driver shrugged. "I believe frightened people buy whatever offers hope." The physician smiled faintly. That observation required no medical education. Hope itself had become valuable currency. As afternoon stretched onward, another messenger arrived from a neighboring village several miles away. His horse breathed heavily after the journey. The animal's coat glistened with rain. The messenger carried a folded letter sealed with dark red wax. It reached the council chamber within minutes. The physician happened to be present when the seal was broken. Everyone leaned closer. The letter was brief. 3 unexplained deaths, several more residents feverish, local physicians uncertain, requesting advice. Silence filled the room once again. Nobody spoke immediately. The council members exchanged weary glances. If neighboring settlements reported similar illnesses, then the problem might already extend beyond their own streets. Travel connected Europe more efficiently than many modern people imagine. Merchants crossed kingdoms. Pilgrims visited distant shrines. Soldiers marched across borders. Students attended universities hundreds of miles from home. Rivers carried cargo deep inland. Coastal ports linked continents through expanding maritime trade. Disease traveled alongside commerce, sometimes slowly, sometimes astonishingly fast. The council chairman finally looked toward the physician. "What would you recommend?" He considered the question carefully. Closing gates entirely might delay infection, or perhaps accomplish nothing if plague had already entered. Allowing unrestricted movement could preserve trade, or spread disaster farther. No answer guaranteed success. "We begin recording every illness," he said. The chairman nodded. "No household omitted." Another nod. "And those caring for the sick should limit unnecessary visitors." The room murmured in agreement. Notice the language. Not imprisonment, not panic, simply reducing opportunities for disease to move from one family to another. Centuries later, epidemiologists would describe concepts such as transmission chains and contact reduction using scientific terminology. The practical instinct behind those ideas, however, had appeared long before bacteria were understood. People learned from painful observation. The meeting ended before sunset. Outside, rain had stopped. Fresh air drifted through the streets, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and wet timber. Children remained indoors. Only a few adults ventured outside, moving quickly between homes, with baskets tucked beneath their arms. The physician accepted another request for a house visit. This family lived beside the old tannery, where leatherworkers transformed animal hides into usable goods. The occupation produced strong odors even during healthy years. According to prevailing medical theory, such smells naturally attracted suspicion whenever plague threatened. As he approached, workers had already abandoned their tools. The tanning pits stood still. Water reflected the darkening evening sky. Inside the modest house, the patient was not elderly, nor middle-aged. She could not have been more than 16. Her mother sat beside the bed, holding one trembling hand. The girl's younger brother remained hidden behind the doorway, watching with frightened curiosity. The physician removed his notebook once more. When did the fever begin? This morning. Has she eaten? Very little. Any pain? The girl answered herself. My head. She touched her neck. And here. The physician gently examined the area. There it was. Another swelling, smaller than the previous patient's, but unmistakable enough to trouble him deeply. He asked additional questions. No recent travel, no visitors, no known contact with earlier patients, or so the family believed. Disease often spread through invisible encounters. People never remembered. A shared marketplace, a borrowed blanket, a shipment of grain, a passing stranger. History frequently leaves such moments undocumented. Entire epidemics may hinge upon interactions lasting only seconds. The physician mixed a preparation from herbs and simple medicines carried in his satchel. Such remedies might reduce discomfort or encourage hydration, but none could reliably cure plague itself. Effective antibiotics would remain centuries in the future. He instructed the mother to keep the girl resting comfortably. Fresh water, warm blankets, quiet surroundings. The advice sounded painfully modest, yet medicine sometimes consists not only of dramatic cures, but also compassionate care. As evening approached, lanterns gradually illuminated windows across town. Not every household lit candles tonight. Some sought to conserve precious supplies. Others simply preferred darkness. It felt somehow more fitting. The physician finally returned toward his own residence. His boots were heavy with mud. His shoulders ached beneath the waxed overcoat. He removed the beaked mask, only after closing the front door behind him. For several moments, he simply breathed. Fresh indoor air. No herbs. No leather. No heavy lenses before his eyes. Only silence. His assistant placed a simple meal upon the table. Dark bread, cheese, a bowl of vegetable broth. The physician thanked him, but scarcely touched the food. Instead, he opened the leather notebook again. 4 suspected cases had become 6. 1 confirmed death. 1 troubling letter from another village. Several anxious meetings. No certainty, only growing concern. He dipped his quill into fresh ink and carefully added 1 final sentence beneath the day's observations. If tomorrow resembles today, the town may yet endure. If tomorrow exceeds today, we must prepare for something far greater. He allowed the ink to dry before closing the notebook. Outside, wind rattled the shutters gently. Somewhere in the distance, another bell began ringing, not slowly this time, but urgently. Not morning, warning. Someone had arrived at the town gates after nightfall, demanding immediate entry, and according to the frightened guards, he carried news from the nearest city that would change everything. The guards did not immediately raise the gate. That alone revealed how much the town had changed within only a few days. Under ordinary circumstances, a traveler arriving after sunset might be questioned briefly before being admitted. Merchants, pilgrims, messengers, and craftsmen regularly reached towns late in the evening after difficult journeys. Delaying them overnight was inconvenient and often considered unnecessary. Now, however, every unfamiliar face inspired hesitation. The rider remained outside beneath the fatting light, his horse breathing heavily after many hours on the road. Rainwater dripped steadily from the animal's mane. The traveler himself looked exhausted rather than dangerous. His cloak was coated with mud, and his boots appeared as though they had not been removed for several days. Still, no one hurried toward him. Instead, the captain of the town watch called from atop the gate. "State your business." The rider looked upward. "I carry a letter from the city magistrates." "Which city?" He answered. The name immediately drew anxious glances among the guards. It was one of the region's largest commercial centers, a place connected to dozens of smaller towns through roads, rivers, and trade routes. Every week wagons departed carrying grain, cloth, wine, salt, timber, leather, and countless ordinary goods that kept daily life moving. Along those same roads traveled rumors. Sometimes they arrived faster than merchandise. The captain hesitated before speaking again. Has illness reached the city? The rider did not answer immediately. His silence proved almost more unsettling than any words. Finally, he nodded. It has. The gate remained closed. Within minutes, a messenger hurried toward the council hall, where several officials had only recently returned home. Lanterns were lit again. Boots hurried across damp cobblestones. The physician, who had barely begun eating his neglected supper, received another knock at his own door. His assistant sighed softly. I feared they would return. So did I. The physician gathered his notebook once more. Night meetings had become increasingly common, whenever disease threatened. Darkness no longer guaranteed rest. By the time he reached the council chamber, nearly everyone had assembled. The rider waited near the entrance. His face looked older than his years. Travel during epidemics carried burdens beyond physical exhaustion. Every village questioned strangers. Every inn feared new arrivals. Every conversation began with the same cautious inquiries. Where have you come from? Who have you seen? Has anyone there been ill? The city seal was broken. One official unfolded the letter carefully. Its contents were longer than anyone expected. Several districts inside the city had reported rapidly increasing deaths over the previous fortnight. Physicians suspected plague, although some still argued for other explanations. Markets remained open, but under growing restrictions. Certain households had already been isolated. Church authorities requested additional prayers. Merchants complained that neighboring regions had begun refusing their goods. The physician listened quietly. None of this surprised him entirely. Large cities occupied unique positions within early modern Europe. Their crowded neighborhoods, busy ports, workshops, inns, and warehouses brought prosperity, while simultaneously creating ideal conditions for contagious diseases to spread. Thousands of people lived, worked, traded, and slept in remarkably close proximity. Crowding itself did not create plague, yet it often made controlling outbreaks far more difficult once they began. The council chairman placed the letter upon the table. If this reaches us, he stopped before finishing. Nobody needed the sentence completed. They all understood. If the city struggled despite greater wealth and larger numbers of physicians, what hope existed for a small provincial town? The physician finally spoke. We prepare. The word sounded simple. Its meaning was enormous. Preparation involved food storage, medical supplies, burial grounds, record keeping, care for widows, protection of children, support for isolated households, communication with neighboring settlements. Every practical detail demanded attention long before panic overtook organization. History often remembers epidemics through dramatic images of overflowing cemeteries and deserted streets. Less often remembered are the countless meetings where ordinary officials discussed flour inventories, firewood supplies, clean water, and the location of temporary shelters. Survival depended as much upon administration as medicine. The meeting continued well past midnight. Before anyone departed, several decisions had been reached. Additional watchmen would monitor travelers entering the town. Local priests would encourage families to report illness promptly rather than hiding sick relatives. Grain reserves would be counted. The physician would examine suspected patients each morning and evening whenever possible. None of these measures guaranteed success. They simply improved the community's chances. When the meeting finally ended, streets had fallen, almost completely silent. Mist drifted across the square. Only the watchmen remained outside, their lanterns casting long golden reflections upon wet stones. The physician paused beside the fountain. He looked upward. Clouds obscured nearly every star. One could almost imagine the entire sky holding its breath. Morning arrived wrapped in cool fog. From his upstairs window, the physician noticed something unusual before even leaving home. The baker's chimney produced no smoke. Yesterday's closure had continued. Across the street, another workshop also remained shut. Small changes accumulated quietly. One closed bakery became 2. One absent merchant became 5. One silent street gradually became an unfamiliar town. His assistant helped arrange fresh herbs inside the beaked mask. Rosemary, lavender, mint, juniper berries. The pleasant scent briefly filled the room. "Do you believe these truly protect us?" the young assistant asked. The physician paused before answering. "I believe people work better when they feel they have not surrendered." The assistant considered that reply. It was neither confirmation nor denial. Throughout history, physicians often balanced scientific uncertainty with human psychology. Patients expected confidence. Communities sought reassurance. Even when treatments remained limited, calm leadership could reduce fear, discourage reckless behavior, and preserve cooperation. Hope, while not medicine itself, sometimes allowed medicine to function. The physician stepped outside. Today's first destination lay near the river. Boats had begun arriving less frequently. Several barges remained tied to wooden docks, their cargo unloaded more slowly than usual. Dock workers exchanged fewer jokes than before. Trade continued. Cautiously, a fisherman repairing his nets recognized the physician. "Doctor, good morning. They say the city is closing neighborhoods. They are considering many measures." The fisherman frowned. "If they close the river," his sentence faded away. Everyone understood the consequences. Rivers served as highways long before railroads, or paved roads transformed transportation. Interrupting river traffic meant delayed food, reduced income, shortages of essential goods, and hardship extending far beyond the epidemic itself. Disease attacked economies almost as effectively as bodies. Nearby, 2 merchants argued over a shipment of wool. "I cannot pay full price. You agreed yesterday." Yesterday was different. Neither man mentioned plague directly. They did not need to. Fear had already begun altering prices. Throughout history, epidemics have reshaped markets in unexpected ways. Some goods became scarce. Others lost value because buyers disappeared. Labor shortages raised wages in certain regions while destroying livelihoods elsewhere. Even before sickness reached every household, uncertainty transformed commerce. The physician continued toward a modest warehouse where town clerks had begun recording incoming travelers, names, places of origin, purpose of visit, length of stay. Such lists reflected an increasingly organized response. Although early modern governments lacked modern epidemiology, many had learned valuable lessons from previous outbreaks. Italian city-states, in particular, pioneered sophisticated quarantine systems during recurring plague epidemics. Specialized health boards inspected ships, monitored travelers, issued health certificates, and sometimes required newcomers to spend weeks in isolation before entering populated areas. The very word ***, quarantine ***, traces its roots to the Italian **quaranta, giorni * 40 days. Communities did not always apply these rules consistently, nor were they always effective, yet they represented remarkable attempts to control disease centuries before microbes were understood. A young clerk dipped his pen into ink. "Your name, doctor." The physician smiled. "You know it already." "I do." "Then why ask?" The clerk shrugged. "The council says every person must be recorded." The physician nodded approvingly. Rules carried greater authority when everyone followed them, even physicians, even officials, especially them. As the morning advanced, he visited another patient, then another. Fortunately, not every fever proved to be plague. An elderly carpenter suffered little more than a severe cold. A child recovered from food poisoning after 2 miserable days. A pregnant woman complained of exhaustion caused simply by the demands of late pregnancy. These ordinary illnesses offered small reminders that life continued producing its usual hardships alongside extraordinary ones. Not every cough signaled catastrophe. Not every headache foretold disaster. Yet distinguishing the ordinary from the extraordinary required patience. Around midday, the physician reached the cooper's workshop. The cooper himself stood outside shaping wooden barrel staves. His daughter, the young woman mentioned the previous day, had spent a restless night. Inside, she appeared weaker. The swelling beneath her arm had enlarged noticeably. Her fever burned hotter than before. She recognized the physician immediately. "Will I die?" The question arrived so quietly that even her father pretended not to hear it. The physician sat beside the bed instead of answering immediately. Outside, the rhythmic sound of hammering continued as apprentices struggled to maintain normal work despite growing anxiety. Finally, he spoke. "I have seen people recover." It was true. Some plague victims survived. Many did not. The exact outcome often depended upon factors no physician of the time could fully understand. Overall health, the form of plague, chance. She closed her eyes. "I am afraid. So is everyone." The honesty surprised her. Perhaps she had expected grand promises. Instead, she received companionship. fear shared between two human beings. Sometimes that was the most truthful comfort available. As he prepared to leave, the cooper followed him into the yard. "Doctor, yes, if the sickness spreads." He glanced toward his workshop. "Who will make the barrels?" The physician looked around. Fresh timber lay stacked beneath rough canvas. Iron hoops rested neatly against the wall. The question sounded practical, yet beneath it lay something much deeper. Who would harvest the grain? Who would bake the bread? Who would shoe the horses? Who would ring the church bells? An epidemic threatened not only individual lives, but the invisible web of skilled people whose daily labor allowed society itself to function. Before the physician could answer, hurried footsteps echoed from the direction of the marketplace. A teenage apprentice came running, breathless, his face drained of color. He struggled to speak between gasps. "The eastern gate." He swallowed hard. "They've stopped another wagon." The physician frowned. "What happened?" The young man looked directly into his eyes. "The driver never woke up, and when the guards climbed onto the wagon to investigate, they discovered he had not been traveling alone. 3 other passengers lay beneath blankets in the back, all burning with fever before they had even reached the town walls. The guards backed away instinctively. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The wagon stood motionless just beyond the eastern gate, its wheels half sunken into the soft earth left behind by yesterday's rain. The horse shifted uneasily, snorting clouds of warm breath into the cool morning air. It had pulled its burden faithfully across miles of countryside, unaware that the greatest danger rested not in wolves or bandits, but beneath the rough wool blankets covering its passengers. The captain of the watch recovered first. "No one touches the wagon." His voice carried clearly across the gatehouse. The order reflected growing caution rather than panic. During previous outbreaks elsewhere in Europe, communities had learned that hastily welcoming exhausted travelers sometimes carried terrible consequences. Many towns gradually developed procedures that, although imperfect, attempted to balance compassion with survival. One guard asked quietly, "What if they're still alive?" The captain looked toward the physician, who had arrived only moments earlier. It was a difficult question. Compassion urged immediate assistance. Experience encouraged careful distance. The physician removed neither gloves nor mask. "We will determine their condition," he said calmly. "But only a few people should approach." He selected 2 volunteers from among the guards. Neither looked particularly eager, yet both stepped forward without complaint. One carried a long wooden staff. The other brought a lantern, though daylight had fully arrived. Habit often outweighed necessity during tense moments. Together, they approached the wagon slowly. The horse flicked its ears, but remained surprisingly calm. Flies buzzed lazily around the harness. The driver still sat where he had fallen, slumped forward against the reins. His hat had slipped over one eye. From a distance, he almost appeared asleep after an exhausting journey. Almost. The physician climbed carefully onto the wagon. He first examined the driver. Cold, no breathing, no pulse. Death had likely arrived several hours earlier. Perhaps, while the horse continued walking almost automatically along the familiar road. Such things happened more often than one might expect. Well-trained horses frequently completed routes even after their owners became too weak to guide them. The physician gently closed the man's eyes. No words were spoken. There would be time later to learn his name. For the moment, the living demanded greater attention than the dead. He turned toward the blankets. A faint cough emerged from beneath the first one. Easy now, the physician said. A middle-aged woman opened her eyes. Confusion clouded her expression. Where? You've reached the town gate. My husband. She looked toward the front of the wagon. The physician did not answer immediately. She followed his silence. Her shoulders relaxed with heartbreaking understanding before she quietly closed her eyes again. Grief sometimes arrived without tears. The second passenger proved barely conscious. A young man, perhaps 20 years old. His lips were dry, his breathing shallow, his forehead burned beneath the physician's gloved hand. The third traveler was a girl no older than 12. She clutched a small cloth doll tightly against her chest. Even in fever, she had refused to let it go. The physician noticed no obvious swellings upon first examination, though thick clothing concealed much. He climbed down from the wagon. The guards waited anxiously. 3 alive, he said. And the driver. The physician lowered his head. No further explanation proved necessary. The captain rubbed his beard thoughtfully. We cannot bring them inside. No, we cannot abandon them. No. The dilemma settled heavily upon everyone present. Throughout Europe's plague centuries, such decisions became painfully familiar. Many towns established temporary isolation houses beyond their walls, or converted barns, monasteries, warehouses, and unused buildings into places where suspected patients could be observed without exposing crowded neighborhoods. These arrangements varied enormously from one region to another. Some were surprisingly organized. Others consisted of little more than desperate improvisation. The physician remembered an abandoned shepherd's cottage, standing nearly half a mile beyond the eastern fields. It possessed a stone roof, a working well nearby, enough space for several beds. It will serve, he said. The captain agreed immediately. Within the hour, townspeople had gathered blankets, water, bread, and simple furniture. Remarkably, no one complained. Fear often encourages selfishness. Yet history also reveals countless examples of quiet generosity during epidemics. A widow donated extra linens. A carpenter offered to repair the cottage door. A farmer volunteered his cart to transport supplies. These names rarely entered history books. Their kindness, nevertheless, helped communities endure. By midday, the travelers rested inside the isolated cottage. Only the physician and 2 designated attendants would enter regularly. Food would be left outside whenever possible. Visitors forbidden. It was a harsh arrangement, yet compared with many plague responses across Europe, it remained relatively humane. Some cities enforced isolation with armed guards. Others nailed infected families inside their homes. Practices differed dramatically depending upon local governments, available resources, and the severity of outbreaks. History seldom offers simple stories. The physician finished examining the young woman once again. This time he discovered a painful swelling near her groin. Another troubling sign. She whispered weakly, "Is this the sickness?" He answered honestly, "I believe it may be." She stared quietly toward the small cottage window. Beyond it stretched peaceful fields, waving gently beneath a summer breeze. Birds continued singing. Clouds drifted lazily overhead. Nature showed no sign that anything extraordinary was unfolding. Epidemics often possess this strange contradiction. The wider world continues almost normally. Trees grow, rain falls, harvests ripen. Only human society seems to lose its rhythm. Leaving the cottage, the physician instructed the attendants carefully. Do not share clothing. Wash whenever possible. Burn heavily soiled bandages. Speak through the doorway unless necessary. Simple advice, limited by contemporary knowledge. Yet every careful habit reduced unnecessary exposure. As he walked back toward town, he encountered a shepherd driving sheep across a nearby hillside. The old man lifted one hand in greeting. "Morning, doctor." The physician returned the gesture. Neither mentioned plague. Instead, they discussed weather, grass quality, the likelihood of early harvest. For several pleasant minutes life felt almost ordinary. Then the shepherd sighed. "My grandson says people are frightened." They are. Were people always so afraid? The physician considered the question. People have always feared what they cannot see. The shepherd nodded slowly. Invisible dangers troubled the imagination more deeply than visible ones. A wolf could be hunted. A storm eventually passed. But disease offered no face to confront, only uncertainty. Back inside the town walls, the marketplace looked different again. Several merchants had departed overnight. Their stalls stood empty. The fish seller had covered his tables entirely. A cloth merchant quietly packed bolts of wool onto a wagon. Business had not ended. It had simply become cautious. The physician stopped beside the fountain. Fresh notices had been nailed to a nearby wooden post. They requested prompt reporting of illness, discouraged unnecessary gatherings, advised cleanliness where practical, asked travelers to identify themselves upon arrival. No one expected these measures to eliminate disease. Rather, they represented attempts to slow confusion before confusion proved as dangerous as the epidemic itself. A small crowd gathered nearby, reading the notices aloud for neighbors unable to read themselves. Literacy remained far from universal. Public reading, therefore, became an important civic service. One elderly woman listened carefully before asking, "So, are we imprisoned?" "No," answered the clerk patiently. "Then why all these rules?" "Because we hope never to need stricter ones." She accepted the explanation with a thoughtful nod. Reason, when offered calmly, sometimes traveled farther than fear. As afternoon shadows lengthened, another message arrived. This one carried no official seal. Instead, it came from a traveling merchant who had reached the outskirts but refused to enter. He shouted his news from a safe distance. The city cemetery is nearly full. Whether entirely accurate remained uncertain. Rumors often expanded while traveling. Still, everyone listening understood the larger message. Conditions elsewhere continued worsening. The physician made another note in his ever-thickening notebook, not because rumors always proved true, but because rumors themselves influenced behavior. People changed travel plans. Merchants altered routes. Families postponed weddings. Pilgrims canceled journeys. Even inaccurate stories shaped history. That evening, after completing one final house visit, the physician finally returned home beneath a sky glowing deep orange with sunset. His assistant had prepared warm stew. This time, he managed several spoonfuls before exhaustion overtook appetite. He opened the notebook once more. The pages now filled more quickly than before. Cases, addresses, symptoms, recoveries, deaths, questions without answers. He paused after writing the day's final entry. His eyes lingered upon a blank page waiting just ahead. For the first time since this strange illness had appeared, he realized something unsettling. He had begun this notebook expecting to record an outbreak. Now he wondered whether he was recording the beginning of an entire chapter in the town's history. Outside, twilight settled gently across rooftops. From somewhere beyond the western fields came the distant sound of another wagon. Then another, then another. The watchman climbed the gate tower, narrowed his eyes toward the road, and felt his stomach tighten. Not one wagon, not two. A small caravan of refugees was slowly approaching the town, carrying everything they still owned, and behind them, rising faintly against the darkening horizon, hung a thin gray column of smoke from the distant city, where entire neighborhoods had reportedly begun burning contaminated belongings in a desperate attempt to halt the spread of the plague. The smoke remained visible long after the sun had disappeared. At first, it looked no different from the countless cooking fires that normally rose above distant villages each evening. But as darkness settled across the countryside, the column continued climbing into the sky, growing broader instead of fading away. The watchman leaned farther over the gatehouse wall. It is still burning. Another guard climbed beside him. Perhaps a warehouse. Perhaps neither man sounded convinced. Across Europe, smoke often accompanied epidemics for reasons that had little to do with accidental fires. Clothing, bedding, straw mattresses, furniture, and even entire wooden structures were sometimes deliberately burned if authorities believed they had been contaminated by disease. The effectiveness of such practices varied greatly. Burning heavily infested bedding could indeed eliminate infected fleas hidden within fabrics, though those carrying out the destruction rarely understood the biological reason. They simply observed that certain objects seemed connected with illness and hoped fire would cleanse what medicine could not. Fire had always represented humanity's oldest disinfectant. Long before bacteria were discovered, people instinctively trusted flames to purify what they feared. The captain ordered the gates to remain closed until sunrise. No exceptions. The approaching caravan would spend the night outside the walls. It sounded cruel, yet most towns across Europe eventually adopted similar precautions during serious outbreaks. Some communities required travelers to wait days. Others insisted upon written certificates proving that their place of origin remained free of disease. In prosperous Italian ports, specially appointed health officials sometimes inspected ships before allowing anyone to disembark. Such measures were imperfect. Sometimes they arrived too late. Sometimes they prevented disaster. Often no one knew which until weeks afterward. The following morning dawned unusually bright. For the first time in several days, the sky held almost no clouds. Sunlight spilled across rooftops, warmed damp stone walls, and filled the marketplace with golden light. Nature seemed determined to remind everyone that beauty could exist besides suffering. The physician rose before first light, as he always had. His routine never varied. Fresh water, simple breakfast, review yesterday's notes, prepare medicines, inspect instruments, fill the beak of the mask with dried herbs. Routine created order. Order resisted fear. His assistant entered carrying fresh rosemary gathered before sunrise. The garden still grows. The physician smiled. It usually does. The young man hesitated. I keep forgetting. Forgetting what? That the world continues. The physician looked through the window. A robin landed upon the fence. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed confidently, completely unaware that human beings had spent another sleepless night worrying about invisible dangers. The world rarely stops, the physician said quietly. We are the ones who change. Those words remained with the assistant long after they left the house. At the eastern gate, nearly 20 travelers waited patiently beside their wagons. Unlike invading armies, or desperate mobs, often imagined in dramatic stories. These refugees looked painfully ordinary, a grandmother knitting despite her circumstances, a carpenter carrying his tools, two monks leading a weary mule, several children still rubbing sleep from their eyes. One family had even brought chickens in wicker baskets. They had not fled in panic. They had simply packed whatever life would fit onto a wagon. The captain greeted them from behind the partially opened gate. "Which road have you traveled?" "The northern highway." "From where?" The eldest traveler answered with the name of the distant city. The captain exchanged another glance with the physician. "The city again. Always the city. When did you leave?" 5 days ago." "Were there illnesses?" A long silence followed. Finally, an elderly woman stepped forward. "There were funerals every day. No embellishment. No dramatic speech. Just quiet exhaustion." The physician began questioning them individually, one by one, carefully. Had anyone developed fever during the journey? No. Persistent cough? No. Painful swellings? No. Several admitted feeling tired. That surprised no one. Traveling rough roads for days, beneath summer heat, exhausted even healthy people. The physician observed faces as much as answers. Medicine often depended upon noticing what words omitted. One little boy caught his attention, not because he appeared ill. Quite the opposite. He was chasing a butterfly across the grass, while adults discussed plague. Children possess a remarkable ability to remain children, even when history unfolds around them. The physician almost envied him. Eventually, the travelers explained why they had left. Business had collapsed. Customers disappeared. Several workshops closed. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some families believed leaving early offered better chances than waiting, until roads became crowded or authorities imposed stricter controls. Their decision reflected a pattern repeated countless times throughout history. When danger approaches gradually, people rarely flee simultaneously. Some leave immediately. Others wait. Many remain until leaving becomes impossible. Each choice carries its own risks. The council faced another difficult decision: permit entry, refuse entirely, require temporary isolation. Arguments continued for nearly an hour. Finally, a compromise emerged. The travelers would remain outside the walls for several days in temporary shelters, while the physician observed their health. Food and water would be provided. Trade postponed. It was inconvenient, perhaps even frustrating, yet considerably kinder than simply turning exhausted families away. Several refugees thanked the council despite the delay. One elderly man removed his hat respectfully. "You have shown more mercy than the last town." No one asked what had happened there. Some answers required no elaboration. Late that afternoon, the physician visited the isolated shepherd's cottage beyond the eastern fields. The 3 patients had survived another night. That alone counted as encouraging news. The young girl still clutched her cloth doll. This morning, she managed a faint smile. "Your herbs smell funny." The physician laughed softly. "I've heard worse opinions." She wrinkled her nose. "They smell like my grandmother's cupboard." "I shall consider that a compliment." For a brief moment, the cottage contained something absent from many places in recent days. Laughter, small, gentle, entirely human. Her mother watched gratefully. She had expected only medicine. Instead, the physician had remembered conversation. Illness often shrinks life until every moment revolves around symptoms. Simple kindness quietly pushes back. The young man remained feverish. His breathing sounded stronger than yesterday. Whether this sign indicated genuine improvement or merely temporary change remained impossible to know. Plague followed unpredictable paths. Some patients worsened suddenly after appearing stable. Others recovered against every expectation. The physician had long ago abandoned confidence in easy predictions. He wrote fresh observations: temperature, breathing, appetite, mental clarity, pain. Tiny details accumulated day after day until patterns slowly emerged. Medical progress has often advanced through disciplined observation rather than dramatic discovery. Before leaving, he stepped outside to inspect the surroundings. The cottage overlooked rolling fields where wheat swayed gently beneath afternoon sunlight. Several crows circled overhead. Nearby, wildflowers continued blooming as though nothing unusual had happened. It struck him again how indifferent nature remained. Disease belonged to human experience. The meadow simply welcomed another summer. Returning toward town, the physician encountered a familiar figure walking alone beside the road. It was the parish priest. His boots were dusty. His shoulders appeared unusually tired. "You've been visiting families." "Since dawn." "Worse?" The priest sighed. "Not yet." Then, after a pause, "But grief has arrived before death." The physician understood immediately. Fear itself had entered many homes. Parents watched children too closely. Neighbors hesitated before shaking hands. Young couples postponed weddings. Old friends greeted each other from opposite sides of the street. Communities often changed emotionally before epidemics reached their greatest intensity. The priest continued walking. "Yesterday, I buried one woman." The physician nodded. "Today, I comforted 12 families who feared they might be next." The numbers lingered in silence. One burial, 12 frightened households. History frequently counts the dead. Far more difficult to measure are the countless hours spent calming those who survived. As they approached the town gates together, they noticed several boys repairing a section of the wooden palisade. One of them waved cheerfully. The physician waved back. Work continued. Repairs continued. Meals were cooked. Fields harvested. Life insisted upon moving forward one ordinary task at a time. That resilience, though rarely celebrated in grand chronicles, would prove every bit as important as medicine. The physician had nearly reached his home when hurried footsteps echoed behind him. His assistant came running through the street, breathing hard. "Doctor, what is it?" "The cooper's daughter." The physician's expression tightened. "What happened?" "Her fever broke." For the first time in days, genuinely hopeful news had arrived. Somewhere inside the frightened town, someone had begun to recover. It was only one patient, one small victory, yet in an age when certainty was scarce. Even a single recovery reminded everyone of an important truth. Plague was not always a death sentence. Some lived, some healed, some returned to ordinary life carrying memories that would remain long after the epidemic itself had passed. The physician immediately turned toward the cooper's workshop, but before he could reach the door, he noticed an unfamiliar carriage standing outside. It bore the crest of the regional governor, and stepping down from that carriage was a finely dressed official accompanied by 2 armed escorts and a leather case stamped with the seal of the Royal Health Commission. The epidemic had just attracted the attention of authorities far beyond the town itself. The arrival of the governor's representative drew curious eyes from every nearby window. Curtains shifted, shutters opened a fraction. People who had carefully avoided gathering in recent days, nevertheless, found themselves watching from a respectful distance. News of important visitors always spread quickly in small towns, and this visitor carried more than polished boots and an official seal. He carried questions, perhaps orders, perhaps both. The carriage itself looked remarkably clean, considering the muddy roads. Its wheels had been washed recently. The horses wore fresh harnesses. Even the leather travel trunk fastened behind the carriage appeared carefully maintained. Such details mattered. Officials responsible for traveling through regions affected by plague often took precautions that reflected lessons learned from earlier epidemics. Clothing could be brushed, baggage aired, correspondence handled carefully, and unnecessary contact reduced. None of these practices guaranteed safety, but they demonstrated an increasing awareness that disease might somehow accompany people and objects, even if the exact mechanism remained unknown. The physician stepped forward. The official removed his gloves before extending one hand, then hesitated. Both men paused. Finally, instead of shaking hands, they acknowledged one another with a respectful nod. A tiny change, one that would have seemed strange only weeks earlier. History often transforms customs quietly. No proclamation had forbidden handshakes. People simply adapted. "You are the town physician." I serve the governor." The physician inclined his head. I have been instructed to assess conditions personally. His voice carried neither arrogance nor fear, only professional seriousness. That, too, reassured the physician. The official opened his leather case. Inside rested neatly folded papers, sealed letters, maps, blank registers, and several small glass bottles containing fragrant vinegar. I understand your counsel has already begun recording illnesses. We have. Excellent. The official seemed genuinely pleased. Contrary to popular imagination, many regional governments during later plague outbreaks attempted surprisingly systematic responses. Italian city-states, parts of France, the Holy Roman Empire, England, and other regions gradually developed boards of health, quarantine regulations, travel permits, mortality registers, and inspection systems based upon painful experience accumulated over generations. These institutions were far from perfect. Records could be inaccurate. Officials sometimes disagreed. Political interests occasionally interfered. Yet they represented important early efforts at organized public health, long before modern epidemiology existed. The governor's representative requested to see the physician's notebook. For a brief moment, the physician hesitated. Those pages contained private observations, failures as well as successes, questions more numerous than answers. Nevertheless, he handed it over. The official examined each page slowly. Names, dates, addresses, symptoms, recoveries, deaths. He occasionally nodded. You keep careful records. I try. You may not realize it now, the official said quietly. But someday such records may prove as valuable as your treatments. The physician looked surprised. At the time, he believed the notebook existed only to help him remember patients. He could not imagine that centuries later historians would reconstruct entire epidemics from similar documents preserved in archives across Europe. Ordinary handwriting often becomes extraordinary evidence. They walked together toward the cooper's workshop. The physician wished to examine the recovering young woman before discussing broader matters. Inside, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The fever that had burned so fiercely the previous day had eased. Not disappeared entirely, but eased. The girl's breathing sounded steadier. Her face, though pale, no longer carried the strained expression of relentless pain. Her father smiled for what felt like the first time in days. I think she asked for soup. The physician laughed softly. That is encouraging. Appetite often returned gradually, in patients beginning to recover from serious illness. Not always, but often enough to inspire cautious optimism. He examined the swelling beneath her arm, still present, still tender, yet slightly softer than before. The physician carefully avoided declaring victory. He had witnessed temporary improvements vanish overnight. Nevertheless, hope had gained another small foothold. The governor's representative observed quietly. When they stepped outside, he spoke in a lower voice. "You believe she will live. I believe she has a better chance today than yesterday." A wise answer. Medicine rewarded humility more reliably than certainty. As afternoon approached, the official requested a tour of the town. They visited the marketplace, the grain stores, the riverside docks, the chapel, the temporary registers recording travelers. Everywhere they went, the official asked practical questions. How much grain remained? How many physicians served the surrounding villages? How many carts could transport supplies? Which buildings might house additional patients if necessary? The physician noticed something interesting. The questions rarely concerned dramatic medical procedures. Instead, they focused upon organization, administration, preparation. Experience had taught governments that epidemics strained every part of society simultaneously. Food, transport, labor, communication, sanitation, medicine alone could never solve such crises. Near the town well, they encountered several women drawing water. Conversation paused briefly as the visitors approached. One elderly woman finally spoke. "Sir," the official removed his hat politely. "My daughter asks whether she should leave the town." The question hung heavily in the afternoon air. It reflected hundreds of similar conversations taking place across Europe whenever plague appeared. Should families remain? Should they flee? There existed no universally correct answer. Travel sometimes carried disease elsewhere. Remaining sometimes meant facing worsening outbreaks. The official answered carefully. "If your household is healthy, avoid unnecessary travel." The physician silently approved. Large movements of frightened populations often complicated epidemics further. People carried fear, sometimes illness, always uncertainty. Later that afternoon, they inspected the isolated cottage beyond the eastern fields. The governor's representative remained outside. He preferred not to enter unless essential. Instead, he questioned the attendants. Had they enough food, fresh water, firewood, clean bedding? One attendant answered proudly, "The townspeople bring what we need." Community support continued quietly despite growing anxiety. The official made another note. Not every report reaching distant authorities described failure. Some documented cooperation. As they prepared to leave, the young girl inside the cottage looked through the open doorway. She waved. The physician waved back. The official noticed. "You know her well. I met her yesterday. She seems fond of you." The physician smiled behind the beaked mask. "I suspect she merely enjoys laughing at my appearance." The official chuckled. So do many adults. For perhaps the first time that day, both men laughed together. Even plague could not entirely extinguish humor. Toward evening, they returned to the council hall. Several local officials had assembled again. Fresh reports awaited them. No new deaths today. 2 additional suspected cases. 1 confirmed recovery. The neighboring village reported another funeral. Travel along the southern road had declined noticeably. Markets in nearby towns now closed earlier than usual. Small facts. Together, they formed a larger picture. The governor's representative unfolded a regional map across the table. Tiny marks indicated settlements reporting illness. Some clusters appeared isolated. Others seemed connected by major trade routes. The physician studied the map carefully. Disease did not spread like spilled ink. It moved through human connections. Roads, markets, ports, families, commerce. Every journey linked one community to another. As candles were lit around the room, the official finally revealed why he had truly come. The governor expects additional physicians. The council members exchanged hopeful glances. When the official hesitated, "We do not know." Silence followed. The larger cities have requested assistance first. Of course they had. Resources during epidemics rarely matched demand. Experienced physicians remained few. Apothecaries were overwhelmed. Supplies disappeared quickly. Every town hoped for help. Not every town received it. The physician accepted the news calmly. He had expected little else. Outside, dusk settled gently across rooftops. The meeting dispersed. The official retired to the local inn, where a separate room had already been prepared. The physician walked home alone through unusually peaceful streets. He noticed something unexpected. Music, faint. Somewhere a family played a simple melody on a wooden flute. Not loudly, not as celebration, perhaps merely to remind themselves that ordinary evenings still existed. The tune drifted softly through the cooling air. For several moments, the physician stopped walking. He listened. History often emphasizes suffering. Yet even during the darkest epidemics, people continued singing, telling stories, baking bread, repairing shoes, falling in love, and comforting children. Life rarely becomes only tragedy. It insists upon including ordinary moments as well. When he reached home, his assistant had already lit the hearth. A fresh page waited inside the notebook. The physician dipped his quill into ink and wrote only a single sentence before closing it for the night. Today reminded me that fear spreads quickly, but so does kindness. He extinguished the candle. Outside, the town settled into uneasy sleep. Far beyond the walls, however, another traveler was making slow progress along the northern road. Unlike the refugees, he traveled entirely alone. His clothes identified him as a university-trained physician. Across the back of his horse hung several polished wooden cases filled with medical instruments, and tucked safely inside his satchel was a newly written manuscript describing an experimental method of controlling plague. An idea so unusual that many learned doctors had already dismissed it as foolish. Within a few days, that stranger would arrive at the town gates, bringing with him not a miracle, but a debate that could divide physicians across the region. The stranger did not know that people were already waiting for him, not by name, not because anyone expected his arrival. Rather, every town touched by epidemic eventually began hopping that somewhere beyond the next hill, along the next road, or aboard the next riverboat. Someone might be carrying an answer that had escaped everyone else. Hope often traveled wearing unfamiliar boots. The physician from the university rode steadily through the cool morning air, his horse moving at an unhurried pace that reflected long experience rather than urgency. Haste exhausted animals. A tired horse could become as dangerous as a broken bridge when journeys stretched across many days. He wore no dramatic robes, no jeweled rings, no elaborate symbols announcing his education, only a dark traveling cloak, sturdy leather boots, and a broad-brimmed hat faded by years beneath the sun. Had an ordinary farmer passed him on the road, he might have mistaken him for another merchant. The most valuable things he carried occupied remarkably little space. Several notebooks, a collection of letters from fellow physicians, simple medical instruments, and a mind shaped by years of observation rather than certainty. Like many educated doctors of his generation, he had studied the writings of ancient authorities such as Hippocrates, and Galen, Their works remained foundational throughout European medicine for centuries. Students copied passages by hand, debated interpretations in university halls, and attempted to reconcile classical ideas with their own experiences during repeated outbreaks of disease. Yet something had begun changing. Slowly, almost invisibly, some physicians increasingly trusted their own observations when they conflicted with inherited wisdom. It marked the quiet beginning of a different way of thinking. Experience itself became evidence. Several miles behind him, another traveler walked on foot. Unlike the physician, this man possessed neither horse nor servant. His clothes showed patches upon patches. A leather satchel rested heavily against one shoulder. Inside lay carefully wrapped bundles of dried plants collected from forests and meadows. Willow bark, sage, comfrey, yarrow, chamomile. He earned his living as an herbal healer. Such practitioners occupied a complicated place within European society. Some possessed generations of practical knowledge about treating wounds, easing fevers, or calming stomach ailments. Others mixed genuine remedies with superstition. Still others became victims of suspicion whenever epidemics appeared. History rarely divides people neatly into real doctors and false healers. Medical practice existed along a broad spectrum. University-trained physicians, surgeons, Barbers, apothecaries, midwives, monastic infirmarians, local herbalists, each contributed something. Each possessed limitations. Each occasionally succeeded. Each occasionally failed. Inside the town, the morning unfolded almost peacefully. The cooper's daughter slept through most of the night. Her fever remained lower. She accepted broth without difficulty. When the physician arrived, her father greeted him with cautious optimism. I think she smiled. That is encouraging. She asked when she could return outside. The physician chuckled softly. A patient asking to leave bed usually worries me less than one refusing to rise. Recovery often came gradually. Strength returned in small portions. One day enough energy to sit upright. Another day enough to speak comfortably. Eventually enough to stand. The body healed at its own patient rhythm. Outside the workshop, apprentices had resumed shaping barrel staves. Their hammers struck wood with familiar rhythm. Take, take, take. For the first time in several days, the sound no longer felt strangely out of place. Normal work returning, even in one workshop, lifted spirits more than grand speeches ever could. Across the marketplace, however, not everyone shared such optimism. The fish seller folded his arms while watching customers pass. Hardly anyone approached. Fresh fish spoiled quickly. Fear spoiled business even faster. His neighbor, who sold cloth imported from distant towns, faced a different problem. People hesitated before touching fabric that had traveled through unknown hands. Trade itself had begun attracting suspicion. A woman paused before the cloth stall. Where did this come from? The Western Valley, not the city. No, she considered for another moment before making her purchase. Such conversations became increasingly common during epidemics. People attempted to judge invisible risk using whatever information they possessed. Origin, distance, rumor, reputation. Sometimes those judgments proved reasonable, sometimes entirely mistaken. The human mind prefers imperfect certainty over complete ignorance. Meanwhile, the governor's representative spent the morning inspecting food supplies. Granaries fascinated him almost as much as medical reports. One councilman appeared puzzled. I expected more questions about disease. You have already asked many. I have. Then why the grain? The official rested one hand upon a sack of wheat. Hungry people become difficult patients. He spoke from experience. Major epidemics often disrupted harvests. Farm laborers fell ill. Markets closed. Transportation slowed. Food shortages could follow disease, especially if communities reacted too late. Protecting harvests therefore became another form of protecting health. History frequently separates famine from epidemic. Reality often intertwined them. Near midday, church bells rang once more, not for another funeral. Instead, they announced a meeting. requested by the parish priest. Families gathered carefully in the churchyard, rather than crowding tightly inside. Some stood several steps apart. Others remained near the edges, beneath ancient trees. The priest climbed the worn stone steps. His sermon differed from those delivered during ordinary Sundays. He spoke of compassion, of patience, of refusing to abandon neighbors, of reporting illness honestly rather than hiding it out of shame. Then he addressed another growing problem. Rumors, they multiply, he said calmly, faster than truth. Several heads nodded. Already people whispered astonishing stories. Some insisted poisoned wells caused the sickness. Others blamed foreign merchants. A few even claimed strange lights had appeared above nearby forests during the previous week. Fear has always encouraged imagination. Modern historians examining plague chronicles frequently discover rumors remarkably similar across different centuries and countries. Invisible danger invites visible explanations. The priest urged caution. If you do not know, say that you do not know. Simple advice, remarkably difficult to follow. That afternoon, the physician finally found time to organize his notebook properly. Until now, he had recorded events chronologically. Today, he began creating separate sections. Recovered, deceased, still ill, under observation, travelers, households requiring assistance. The governor's representative noticed the changes. A sensible improvement. I can no longer remember everything. No one can. The notebook itself had become an extension of memory. Across Europe, administrators increasingly relied upon written records during epidemics. Lists reduced confusion. Registers revealed patterns. Mortality counts, though sometimes inaccurate, allowed authorities to estimate whether conditions improved or deteriorated. Paper became another tool against uncertainty. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the square, laughter unexpectedly echoed between the buildings. Several children had resumed playing, not large games involving dozens of companions. Only 3 siblings rolling a wooden hoop along the street. Their mother watched from the doorway, ready to call them inside at the slightest concern. Yet she allowed them those precious moments. Childhood persisted. The physician paused to watch. His assistant smiled. I had forgotten what that sounded like. So had I. For a brief while, the town remembered itself. Later, while visiting the eastern gate, the physician noticed movement upon the northern road. A lone rider, still distant. The gate captain shaded his eyes. Another traveler. The physician followed his gaze. Even from afar, something appeared unusual. The rider maintained a steady, disciplined pace, neither hurried nor hesitated. Confident, experienced, not the desperate rhythm of refugees. The governor's representative joined them atop the wall. You expected someone. No. The official narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Perhaps we soon shall. As the horse drew nearer, details gradually emerged. Weathered saddlebags, polished wooden instrument cases, a university-style cloak fastened with a simple clasp. Not wealthy, not poor, educated. The physician felt unexpected curiosity. The stranger halted several yards before the gate without needing to be instructed. He understood the new customs immediately. Removing his hat politely, he called upward. "My name is Dr. Matthias Keller. I come from the university at Padua, asterisk. I carry letters for your governor, and I ask permission, not immediate entry, but merely the opportunity to speak." The governor's representative stiffened. Padua, one of Europe's most respected medical universities, a place where generations of physicians had studied anatomy, surgery, and natural philosophy. The representative looked toward the town physician, then back toward the newcomer. "What brings you here?" Dr. Keller answered with remarkable calm. "I have spent the last 3 years studying plague outbreaks across northern Italy." A hush settled over the gate. "I believe," he continued, "that many physicians are asking the wrong questions." No one replied. Even the breeze seemed to pause, because in an age when ancient authorities were rarely challenged openly, a traveler claiming that generations of learned doctors might be mistaken was about to introduce an idea bold enough to unsettle not only this small town, but perhaps everyone responsible for fighting the plague. The silence that followed seemed to stretch far longer than it truly did. No one at the gate immediately welcomed Dr. Matthias Keller. Neither did anyone dismiss him. The governor's representative studied the traveler's face with the practiced caution of a man accustomed to weighing people before trusting them. "You understand," he finally said, "that we cannot simply open the gates." "I would have been disappointed if you had," Keller replied. The answer surprised several guards. There was no offense in his voice, only understanding. "In the last 2 months," he continued, "I have been kept outside 6 different towns before anyone allowed me to enter." "And did they eventually admit you?" "Some did. And the others?" Keller smiled faintly. "I continued riding." The physician, standing beside the gate captain, listened carefully. Confidence often impressed people. Too much confidence usually made him suspicious. This traveler possessed something different. He spoke neither as a man promising miracles, nor as one seeking admiration. Instead, he sounded like someone accustomed to disappointment. The governor's representative called down again. "Your letters." Without hesitation, Keller removed a leather tube from his saddle and placed it carefully upon the ground. He stepped backward several paces. "You may retrieve them." The precaution pleased everyone watching. Even correspondence inspired caution during plague years. In some regions, officials aired letters, exposed them to smoke or vinegar vapors, or handled them as little as possible. Modern historians debate how effective such practices truly were, but they reveal an increasing awareness that disease might somehow accompany objects as well as people. A guard retrieved the tube using a long wooden hook. No one laughed. Precautions that might once have seemed excessive now appeared entirely reasonable. The seals proved genuine. One letter bore the crest of the University of Padua. Another carried the governor's own insignia. The representative broke the first seal. He read silently, then more slowly. Finally, he looked toward the physician. It appears Dr. Keller has indeed been sent with official recommendations. What sort of recommendations? The representative frowned thoughtfully. Not treatments. No, no. He reread one passage. They concern organization. That answer puzzled several council members who had gathered behind the gate. Organization. Surely physicians should discuss medicines rather than paperwork. Keller seemed to anticipate the confusion. If you permit, he called politely, I can explain from here. The governor's representative nodded. Speak. The traveler rested one hand upon his saddle. I have visited 12 towns during the past 3 years. Some wealthy, some poor, some lost hundreds. Others escaped with comparatively few deaths. The guards listened as intently as scholars. And what made the difference? Asked the town physician. Keller paused. Rarely medicine. A murmur spread quietly among those assembled. Instead of continuing immediately, he chose his words carefully. I found no herb capable of ending plague, no prayer that guaranteed survival, no physician whose skill alone determined the outcome. He looked toward the surrounding fields. What I did discover was that towns keeping careful records, separating suspected cases early, maintaining reliable food supplies, and communicating honestly with neighboring communities often endured better than those relying only upon hope. The physician found himself nodding, almost unconsciously. Nothing Keller described sounded revolutionary, yet hearing those observations gathered from many different outbreaks gave them unexpected weight. Experience, accumulated across regions, became knowledge. One councilman folded his arms. So you bring us no cure. Keller smiled gently. I wish I did. His honesty disarmed criticism before it fully formed. After lengthy discussion, the council reached a compromise. Dr. Keller would not immediately enter the town. Instead, he would spend 2 days in the same temporary isolation area, already housing healthy refugee families outside the walls. If he remained well, he would then be admitted. Keller accepted without protest. In truth, he admitted, I expected longer. The physician escorted him personally toward the temporary encampment beyond the eastern fields. Along the way, they spoke at a respectful distance. You studied in Padua. I did, and before that, my father was a village physician. The town physician smiled. So was mine. For several minutes, they discussed teachers, medical texts, difficult winters, and endless travel. The conversation gradually shifted elsewhere. You said physicians ask the wrong questions. I did. What should we ask instead? Keller looked across the fields, where farmers continued harvesting wheat despite everything. We ask how to cure plague. And perhaps we should also ask how towns survive it. The older physician remained silent. The distinction seemed subtle, yet profoundly important. Medicine saved individuals. Organization preserved communities. History required both. The refugee encampment had become surprisingly orderly. Simple shelters stood in neat rows. Fresh water buckets rested beneath canvas coverings. Food arrived twice daily from the town. Children had even invented games, using smooth stones gathered from nearby fields. Life adapted remarkably quickly. One elderly refugee greeted Keller warmly. Another traveler. So it seems. You'll find the bread acceptable. And the company. The old man laughed. Better than sleeping beside the road. Despite uncertainty, a small temporary community had begun forming. Shared hardship often encouraged cooperation among strangers. Keller unpacked only a few belongings. Books, writing materials, medical instruments, several carefully wrapped notebooks. The town physician noticed them immediately. You keep journals every day. For how long? Nearly 15 years. The older physician whistled softly. Then you carry a small library. I carry many mistakes. The reply earned genuine laughter. Scientific progress rarely advances through perfect certainty. It often grows from carefully remembering previous errors. That evening, the physician returned inside the town, while Keller remained beyond the walls. The council meeting resumed shortly afterward. Reports arrived one after another. The isolated young girl had eaten nearly half a loaf of bread. The refugee families remained healthy. The cooper's daughter had walked a few steps across her room with assistance. 2 suspected patients no longer showed plague symptoms after all. Encouraging news accumulated slowly. Not enough to declare victory, enough to lift weary spirits. Then another messenger arrived. This one from the southern road. His horse looked exhausted. Unlike previous reports, his message contained welcome news. One neighboring village had completed nearly 3 weeks without a new suspected case. The physician smiled. So outbreaks do end. The governor's representative nodded. They always have. That simple reminder mattered enormously. People living inside epidemics often struggle to imagine life beyond them. Yet every historical plague outbreak, regardless of severity, eventually declined, sometimes through changing seasons, sometimes because susceptible populations decreased, sometimes through improved isolation measures, often through combinations historians still debate. No epidemic lasted forever. The following morning dawned cool and clear. Mist drifted gently above the river. Dockworkers cautiously resumed, unloading several barges carrying timber rather than food. Business returned one careful step at a time. The physician visited the isolated cottage once more. The young girl greeted him with unexpected seriousness. "Doctor, yes, when can I go home?" He knelt beside her chair. "When you are strong enough. I miss my cat." "What is your cat called?" "Buttons." The physician smiled. "That is an excellent name. Do you think Buttons misses me?" He considered the question. "I would not be surprised." Children often anchored themselves to wonderfully ordinary concerns, even during extraordinary circumstances. Not politics, not epidemics. Cats, toys, favorite blankets. Those small attachments quietly preserved hope. Her mother watched the conversation with grateful eyes. No medicine could replace it. Leaving the cottage, the physician encountered Keller walking along the permitted boundary near the encampment. Maintaining appropriate distance, they resumed yesterday's discussion. "What did your notebooks teach you?" asked the older physician. Keller thought for several moments. "That fear arrives first, and after fear, confusion, and after confusion." He looked back toward the refugee shelters. "People begin helping one another." The physician raised an eyebrow. "Always. No, but far more often than history remembers." That observation lingered throughout the walk. Chronicles frequently recorded disasters, heroic leaders, terrible mortality. Less frequently, they described neighbors quietly delivering soup, repairing roofs, caring for orphaned children, or harvesting fields belonging to sick families. Ordinary kindness rarely attracted chroniclers, yet communities depended upon it. As the sun climbed higher, another matter demanded attention. Several merchants requested permission to reopen the weekly market fully. The council debated for hours. Closing commerce too long risked economic hardship. Opening too quickly risked encouraging unnecessary crowds. The governor's representative proposed a compromise inspired by practices used elsewhere. Stalls spread farther apart. Food sellers separated from livestock. Travelers registered before trading. The marketplace would remain open fewer hours. Simple adjustments, nothing dramatic, yet they reflected an emerging understanding that reducing close contact, where practical, might slow transmission without halting daily life entirely. The proposal passed. Some merchants grumbled. Most accepted it. Life seldom returns suddenly after crisis. It inches forward. Late that afternoon, the physician received another invitation to the Cooper's home. This time, however, it was not for treatment. The recovering young woman wished to thank him personally. She sat beside an open window, pale but unmistakably stronger. Fresh air drifted through the room. Her father poured 2 small cups of watered wine. I feared we would never share another meal together, he admitted quietly. The physician accepted the drink. No physician ever tires of being proven wrong by recovery. The young woman smiled. I hardly remember the worst days. That is sometimes a kindness. Outside, hammering resumed once again. The cooper's apprentices had returned to building barrels. Children's voices echoed faintly down the street. Someone nearby baked fresh bread. Ordinary sounds, beautiful because they had nearly disappeared. As the physician prepared to leave, the cooper stopped him at the doorway. I have something for you. He disappeared briefly into the workshop. When he returned, he carried a beautifully crafted wooden box, no larger than a book. For your notebooks. The physician examined the workmanship. Perfectly fitted joints, smooth polished oak, simple, elegant. I cannot accept payment. It is not payment. The cooper shook his head. It is gratitude. The physician finally accepted. Years later, long after the epidemic had faded into memory, that humble wooden box would still protect the notebooks recording these remarkable months, not because it was expensive, but because it had been built during a time when hope itself felt worth preserving. As evening settled across the town, a cool breeze carried the scent of freshly cut wheat from the surrounding fields. The physician glanced toward the northern road, almost absent-mindedly. A lone figure was approaching on foot. Not a merchant, not a refugee, not another physician. His black robes marked him as a scholar from a monastery, and strapped securely across his back was a weathered chest filled with manuscripts copied from libraries across Europe. Manuscripts containing forgotten accounts of plague outbreaks centuries earlier, including descriptions that appeared to contradict everything contemporary physicians believed they knew. The monk walked with the measured pace of someone who had spent much of his life traveling on foot. He did not hurry toward the town. Neither did he pause to rest. Every few hundred steps, he shifted the worn wooden chest, resting across his shoulders before continuing onward. The leather straps supporting its weight had been repaired many times over the years. So had his sandals. Dust coated the hem of his black robe. Rain had faded its color from deep charcoal to soft gray. The physician watched him from the town wall beside the governor's representative. He has come a long way, so it would seem. Unlike merchants, pilgrims, or messengers, monks often traveled between monasteries carrying books rather than cargo. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, monasteries preserved countless manuscripts by patiently copying them by hand generation after generation. Without those quiet rooms filled with parchment and ink, much of Europe's written history would simply have disappeared. The gate captain called down, "State your name." The monk stopped immediately. "I am Brother Thomas of St. Michael's Abbey. And your purpose?" "I seek shelter." He rested one hand upon the wooden chest. and I carry historical records requested by Dr. Matthias Keller. The physician exchanged another glance with the governor's representative. So Keller had expected him. Interesting. The gate remained closed. As before, no exceptions would be made. Brother Thomas accepted the decision with remarkable calm. I have slept beneath enough trees to survive another evening. He smiled warmly. I only ask that the manuscripts remain dry. Within minutes, several guards carried a canvas covering outside the walls to protect the wooden chest from possible rain. Even during epidemics, books possessed value, sometimes greater value than gold. Dr. Keller welcomed the monk at the temporary encampment. The two men embraced only with words, not with hands. Another small adaptation to uncertain times. You found them. Brother Thomas nodded proudly. Not easily. He carefully unlocked the weathered chest. Inside rested bundles of parchment, wrapped in linen. Some looked centuries old. Others had clearly been copied more recently. Each bundle carried handwritten labels, identifying monasteries, towns, or years. The town physician, granted permission to observe from an appropriate distance, could scarcely hide his fascination. What exactly are these? Brother Thomas smiled. Memories. He lifted the first manuscript with extraordinary care. A chronicle from northern Italy. Another, hospital records copied from a monastery near Venice. A third, letters written during the Great Plague at Milan. Each document represented someone who had lived through another epidemic, someone who had observed, recorded, remembered. History itself had become another teacher. The following morning, after the required observation period had passed without signs of illness, the council allowed Brother Thomas to enter the town under the same precautions already governing other visitors. His first destination surprised everyone. Not the church, not the inn, the library, or rather what passed for one. The town possessed only a modest collection of books, stored in a small room beside the council hall. Legal documents, parish registers, land records, a handful of medical texts, several volumes of classical philosophy. Brother Thomas placed his manuscripts gently upon the large oak table. Dr. Keller joined him. So did the town physician. The governor's representative quietly closed the door behind them. 3 physicians, 1 monk, a room full of parchment. Outside, life continued almost normally. Inside, centuries of accumulated experience waited to speak. Keller unrolled the first chronicle. Its Latin script flowed neatly across yellowed parchment. Brother Thomas translated slowly where necessary. This account describes an outbreak nearly 300 years ago. The town physician leaned closer. What does it say? Brother Thomas read aloud. Many physicians disagreed with one another. Some urged flight. Others remained. Some prescribed bleeding. Others recommended rest and fresh air. Yet no remedy succeeded equally for every patient. The physician nodded thoughtfully. Nothing there surprised him. Medical disagreement had always existed. Keller pointed farther down the page. What comes next? Brother Thomas continued. The city elders who counted the sick each day understood the progress of the pestilence better than those who relied only upon rumor. Silence settled around the table. The governor's representative smiled faintly. Records again. Keller nodded. Again, another manuscript described quarantine regulations from an Italian port. Another emphasized the importance of maintaining food supplies during prolonged isolation. Still another warned against concealing illness out of fear of punishment. The physician gradually noticed something remarkable. Different centuries, different regions, different authors, yet similar practical lessons appeared repeatedly, not because people understood bacteria, but because repeated experience had taught painful patterns. History itself had become a laboratory. Outside, meanwhile, ordinary life quietly advanced. The revised marketplace opened under its new arrangement. Stalls stood farther apart than before. Livestock occupied a separate corner near the river. Travelers registered their names before trading. At first, the changes felt awkward. Customers wandered uncertainly between wider spaces. Merchants complained about carrying goods farther. Children asked endless questions. Within an hour, everyone had adjusted. Human beings adapt surprisingly quickly once routines begin settling into habit. The fish seller even laughed. I can actually hear customers now. His neighbor grinned, and I can smell your fish from twice the distance. Laughter returned, briefly, but genuinely. Near noon, encouraging news spread through the town. The young man isolated inside the shepherd's cottage had finally eaten a full meal. Only bread, cheese, a little broth, yet the attendants celebrated as though he had conquered a kingdom. Appetite often marked returning strength. The physician visited immediately. The patient looked exhausted, but alert. You've been causing everyone concern. The young man managed a weak smile. I apologize. No need. You should see the other fellow. The physician blinked. What other fellow? The driver. The room became quiet. For several moments, neither spoke. Then the young man looked toward the window. I keep forgetting. The physician rested one gloved hand gently upon the blanket. Grief often arrived in waves. Illness postponed mourning. Recovery sometimes released it all at once. Later that afternoon, Brother Thomas made an unexpected request. He wished to visit the cemetery, not because another funeral had taken place. Rather, he believed graveyards revealed important historical information. The physician accompanied him. Rows of simple wooden crosses stretched across gently sloping ground behind the chapel. some graves fresh, others centuries old. Brother Thomas knelt beside several weathered stones, whose inscriptions had nearly vanished. Our abbey copied burial registers from here long ago. The physician looked surprised. From this town, from many towns, Brother Thomas smiled. Monks are patient collectors. He opened a small notebook. 212 years ago, another epidemic reached this valley. The physician frowned. I never knew. Most people do not. Time gradually softens memory. One generation remembers vividly. The next recalls only stories. By the third, even stories begin fading. History survives only when someone chooses to preserve it. Brother Thomas gently brushed moss away from an old stone. No one standing here today remembers these people personally. He paused, yet they lived. They feared. They hoped. They buried loved ones. In that, they were no different from us. The physician looked across the quiet cemetery. For the first time since the epidemic began, he felt connected not merely to his own patients, but to countless physicians who had stood in similar places across centuries. Different names, same struggle. As evening approached, the governor's representative announced another piece of encouraging news. Regional reports suggested the large city to the south had experienced fewer deaths during the previous week than the week before. No one declared the epidemic finished. That would have been foolish. Numbers often fluctuated. Nevertheless, any sign of decline deserved cautious attention. Keller remained careful. 1 week is not a pattern. No, agreed the physician, but perhaps it is the beginning of one. Hope required discipline, just as fear did. Neither should outrun evidence. That night, after supper, the 4 scholars gathered once again around the library table. Candles flickered softly. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Brother Thomas produced another manuscript, unlike the others. This one interests me most. The parchment looked older, much older. Its edges had darkened with age. The original was written shortly after the Great Plague of the 14th century. The physician leaned forward. The Black Death. Brother Thomas nodded. It survived only because generations of monks copied it. He carefully translated a passage. The pestilence teaches humility. Physicians discover the limits of knowledge. Priests discover the limits of words. Rulers discover the limits of power. Yet neighbors discover the strength they did not know they possessed. No one spoke for several moments. Rain continued tapping softly outside. The physician finally broke the silence. Who wrote that? Brother Thomas smiled sadly. We do not know. The author's name had been lost centuries earlier. Only the words remained. History often remembers kings. Sometimes the wisest observations survive without any name attached at all. The governor's representative slowly rolled the manuscript closed. We should preserve copies. Brother Thomas nodded. is why I carried them. Knowledge preserved today might protect people generations later. The physician glanced toward his own notebook, resting inside the wooden box gifted by the cooper. Until this evening, he had regarded it as little more than a personal record. Now he wondered, perhaps someday another physician, centuries in the future, might open those pages searching not for miracles, but for understanding. Outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond the distant hills. The rain grew heavier. A messenger, soaked from head to toe, hurried through the darkness toward the council hall, carrying an oilskin packet sealed with black wax. He had ridden without stopping from the regional capital. The seal belonged not to the governor this time, but to the royal court itself. Whatever message waited inside had become important enough to reach the attention of the kingdom's highest authorities. The messenger refused food. He accepted only a cup of water, while rain continued dripping steadily from his cloak onto the stone floor of the council hall. His horse, exhausted from the journey, had already been led toward the stable, where a stable boy gently rubbed the animal dry with old wool blankets. Even in moments of urgency, ordinary acts of care quietly continued in the background. The black wax seal resting upon the table drew every eye in the room. Royal correspondence arrived only rarely in towns like this. The governor's representative broke the seal with deliberate care. The room remained completely silent. He unfolded the heavy parchment and began reading. The message was not dramatic. There were no promises of miracle medicines, no announcement that the plague had suddenly disappeared. Instead, the royal court instructed regional officials to continue strengthening communication between towns, maintain careful records of illness, support local physicians, preserve food supplies, and avoid unnecessary panic whenever possible. It was, in many ways, a remarkably practical document. Dr. Keller smiled quietly. The kingdom is beginning to learn. So it seems, replied the town physician. History rarely changes because of one brilliant idea appearing overnight. More often, progress comes when thousands of small observations gradually become shared knowledge. One town discovers something useful, another improves upon it, a third records the results. Years later, those scattered lessons begin forming something recognizable as public health. The physician looked around the room. Only a few weeks earlier, everyone had felt isolated. Now they were connected to neighboring villages, regional officials, university physicians, monasteries preserving old manuscripts, and even the royal court itself. Knowledge traveled more slowly than disease, yet it traveled nonetheless. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. Morning arrived wrapped in clear, cool air. Sunlight reflected from rain-soaked rooftops, until the entire town seemed brighter than it had in many days. The physician made his familiar rounds. The cooper's daughter stepped outside her home for the first time. leaning gently upon her father's arm. The young girl in the shepherd's cottage laughed when Buttons, her beloved cat, was finally brought to visit her under careful supervision. The refugee families continued waiting patiently, grateful simply to be safe. The marketplace sounded a little livelier. The church bell rang for morning prayers instead of another funeral. None of these moments alone marked the end of the epidemic. Together, however, they reminded everyone that life possesses an extraordinary determination to return. Brother Thomas spent his final afternoon carefully copying passages from the physician's notebook into fresh parchment. Not every page, only observations that future generations might someday find useful. Dr. Keller packed his instruments once more. His work would continue elsewhere. Another town, another road, another community searching for answers. Before departing, he turned toward the physician. We did not defeat plague. No, but we learned. Yes, and perhaps those who come after us will begin one step farther than we did. The physician watched his new friend ride slowly northward until both horse and rider disappeared beyond a line of distant trees. The road remained. There would always be another traveler, another physician, another generation asking difficult questions. Centuries later, science would finally identify the tiny bacterium Yersinia pestis asterisk, explain the role of fleas and rodents in many outbreaks, develop effective quarantine systems based upon germ theory rather than miasma, and eventually discover antibiotics capable of treating plague when given promptly. The beaked mask, once believed to filter poisonous air, would become one of history's most recognizable symbols, not because it conquered disease, but because it represented humanity's determination to confront the unknown with whatever knowledge it possessed. Modern medicine did not appear all at once. It was built patiently upon thousands of observations, countless failures, quiet acts of courage, careful records, and generations of physicians willing to admit what they did not yet understand. The plague doctors were never magical healers. Neither were they merely eerie figures wandering empty streets. They were human beings living at the edge of knowledge, trying to protect life while standing face to face with one of history's most terrifying diseases. Some made mistakes. Some showed remarkable compassion. Many did both, and perhaps that is why they continue to fascinate us centuries later, not because they wore frightening masks, but because behind every beak-shaped mask stood an ordinary person confronting extraordinary uncertainty, the same challenge that has shaped so much of human history. As evening settled over the town one last time, the physician returned to his desk. He opened the wooden box the Cooper had crafted. Inside rested the notebook that had accompanied him through every anxious morning, every difficult decision, every small victory, and every heartbreaking loss. He dipped his quill into fresh ink and wrote one final line. May those who read these pages someday know more than we did, suffer less than we did, and remember those we could not save. He closed the notebook gently. Outside, the church bells rang once more. This time, they did not sound like fear. They sounded simply like another ordinary evening in a town that had endured. The candle burned lower. The streets grew quiet. The wind carried the scent of damp earth through the open window. And little by little, history settled into memory. Thank you for joining me on this slow journey through one of history's most haunting chapters. If you found it relaxing, fascinating, or simply a peaceful way to end your day, I'd love to have you back for another story. Until next time, sleep well and let history fade gently into your dreams.